This is 3ABN Now with John and Rosemary Malkovich.
Hello and welcome to 3ABN Now. We're glad you've joined us today because we have a special feature. Today's program is all about the Magna Carta, which involves our civil and religious liberties. So we're going to go through the history of this magnificent charter that was drawn up and examine what impact it actually has on us today. With us we have very special guests. We have Barry Harker, our radio manager.
And he's been with us many times,
He's
Rosie.
used to being on a program like this. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you.
We have David Fitzgibbon, who is a retired barrister, and he's going to be talking to us about the law side of the Magna Carta and its impact on us today. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
And we have Harold Harker, who is a historian as well as a pastor, and Harold's going to be talking about the history side. Now, Harold is Barry's cousin. So I just want to establish that at the start. So welcome, Pastor Harold.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here today. Now, before we get going, John has something very special for us which matches in with today's program.
Yeah, we have a text from the Bible, and it's found in Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. You know, we serve a God, and we're so grateful that our God is just, He's merciful, He's gracious, because when we look at the scheme of things, He wants us to be good citizens on this planet Earth. And we really need to understand that God wants us to do that, not just to be out there doing things on our own, but we are responsible for society, the governance of this country, looking after the things that God has entrusted to us. I'm going to read this verse to you. It's found again, I said, in Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. It says, He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee? To do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Harold, what do you see in that?
That's a great verse, and God wants us to be like Him.
That's right. It's all about doing good to other people, as Jesus did when He came on, walking on this earth as a man.
Correct.
He showed the character of God, which is all about looking after others' interests, not your own. And that verse, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with thy God, that's what it's all about. And that's what we are discussing here today.
David, what's your thoughts on that?
I find that particularly attractive. I find that it sums up really what we're talking about today as a whole.
Okay.
We're looking at the history, we're looking at where they were in 1215, where we are today. I find that very important.
Barry, do you see humbleness being shown now by men today in the society which we live in?
Not always. Not if you look at the world scene, you see very little of it. The issue of justice and mercy is absolutely foundational to our lifestyle. So if we don't have it, we really don't have a lifestyle that's worth living. And so these are crucial issues, as you mentioned right at the beginning, Rosemary, crucial issues about the nature of our society and also the way in which we live in it.
I have a particular interest in the Magna Carta, personal, and actually you should look it up on the internet. It's extremely fascinating, the whole background of the Magna Carta. With the specific players in the story, you may, just to put in a bit of a historical context, you'll remember probably hearing about Richard the Lionheart, Richard I of England and France, places in France that he was in charge of. He went down and fought the Crusades and things, but his main thing was that he was placed in history in the time of the stories of Robin Hood, which are basically based on fiction, I think. But he was a real person. He had a brother, John, as well as some others, and John ended up taking over the kingdom from him. And it was in the reign of John that the Magna Carta was first drawn up. And I have two relatives, or two ancient relatives.
Forebears.
I don't know, forebears. I don't know if they're actually in my specific lineage or whether they were branched off from one of my ancestors, Thurston the Norman, who went to England in 1066. with William the Conqueror. But they were in the branch of the family from Thurston, and that was Alan and Thomas Bassett. But they signed, as we will find out as we go through the history, on the side of the king, which actually was unfortunately not the right side to be on.
Certainly on the wrong side of history.
but they signed on the side as what was it called? They were king's councillors.
Yeah.
So they signed the Magna Carta in 1215, but they also, Alan was also a witness to the re-signing of it in 1216.
Right.
So this has personal interest to me, this discussion today.
Yeah.
So Harold, please fill our viewers in, and us as well, on the history of the Magna Carta.
Well, the Magna Carta was written in Latin. In fact, the name Magna Carta really means the Great Charter. And it was the first great charter of English liberty. And it defined the role of the king and showed that no one is above the law. Even the king is not above the law. And the barons, it's interesting when we go into the history of why they asked him to sign this. But it's the first document which lays the foundation for future bills and acts that were passed that has gone not only to Britain and England, but to the rest of the world. Even the American Constitution has a foundation from this Magna Carta. So it's a vital document in history, and its effect is right around the world.
And the reason why we're talking about it is because it was signed on June 15, 1215,
1215.
which is 100 years this year, 800 years. So that's why we're talking about it today. It's very important. 800 years ago, this Magna Carta was signed, and that's why we want to discuss it, to let you know what it was about and where we are in relation to the Magna Carta today.
One of the things that's 800 years ago, you kind of wonder, we're now in this 21st century, what has it got to do with it all? You know,
Well, we'll come to that at the end,
know.
but I know people will be very interested to find out. Fascinating.
Well, essentially our whole lifestyle swings in the West on Magna Carta. Our system of law, our system of government can be traced back to Magna Carta. It's also had a tremendous influence across the world. It's escaped the English-speaking world and had an influence on the French Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789,
Yes.
and also on the Declaration of Human Rights, United Nations Declaration in 1948. So really, it's one of the most important documents in history.
And we're going to discuss a bit later, David's going to tell us about the legal side of it and its implications in our everyday life, which I'm really looking forward to.
Rosalie,
Fascinating stuff.
Sir Robert Worcester, who is the one leading up the 800-year celebration of Magna Carta, described this document as the greatest export that England has ever made.
That's wonderful, because it has affected so many
Surely.
centuries of living on this earth. Now, so Harold, give us some background. What was it like living in England or Britain prior to the signing of this, under Richard, under his brother John, his father Henry II, and further back?
Well, if you live there, this document does not cover ordinary people who were called serfs or villeins.
Medieval system.
Yeah, it was a feudal society, but it covered free men and the knights and the barons and those who had some title. It showed where the king should be in relation to those and not just usurp his own authority. It showed how the king had to, if he was levying taxes, it had to be by agreement. And it also showed due process of law, so that you couldn't be imprisoned and just left to rot. So, you know, these are foreshadows of what we see in later things. But to live there, you didn't have the liberties that we have today. It was not a very nice place to live. If the king didn't like you or the local baron didn't like you, you were disadvantaged. You were down and out. And so this charter becomes what the forerunner of all of our liberties, and they're all enshrined in this great document. No wonder it's called the Great Charter.
Before that, the serfs were treated as slaves, weren't they?
Correct.
The ordinary common person.
Yes.
Yes.
They were slaves to the people who were the landowners who had the money. But the landowners were basically slaves to the king.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
But you couldn't even go and catch a deer or a rabbit from the bush. It all was all owned by the barons or by the king. In fact, that was death if you went and got that. It was a terrible place to live. I'm glad we're living in the 21st century rather than the 13th.
I think what Magna Carta did was make society predictable. Prior to that, the king's actions could be quite capricious. If you got up in the morning, you wouldn't quite know what was going to happen to you that day.
You wouldn't know whether his wife had burnt his toast or not.
So you have a situation where the Magna Carta starts to bring some order and some principles like due process into our society.
It was foundational, wasn't it? The whole agreement was foundational for any governance throughout time from that time forward.
But imagine living your life where you can't predict what's going to happen.
That's right.
Not quite sure what's going to happen. It would be very, very difficult to live in that society.
So what happened just prior to the signing of this? I mean, the English society was under actually the king was under the control of the Pope in Rome, wasn't he?
Yes.
So what happened in
Let
that
me go back.
situation?
When you mentioned the Normans who came across in 1066, and they did in Harold, that wasn't a great thing, was it?
No, just because your name's Harold.
That's right. But when William the Conqueror came in, he brought all his Norman nobles with him, the barons, and the Kingdom of England comprised half of what is now France. Normandy and Aquitaine and all this western area of France was part of the English crown, or the Norman crown, if you like. Now, in this time, the king had to always defend his realm. And so whether it was John or Henry before him, they were defending these areas, these parts of the kingdom over in France. And to defend it, you need money and you need soldiers. Now, at this time, John was one who was levying taxes like no one had done before.
Since Solomon.
Well, he did it times more than any other preceding sovereign of England. And
You see, even in times of peace,
yeah,
John was putting taxes on the people to pay for these expensive wars which he managed to lose. That was his problem, and that,
Well, his,
you know,
his
that was,
brother Richard was known as a great strategist and
yes,
commanded an army of his own at the age of 16. And he was known to be someone you don't want to battle with Richard the Lionheart, but his brother John obviously.
but
John was a very
was not
competent
in that.
administrator, wasn't he?
That's right.
But not a very good soldier.
But a very, very poor soldier.
Correct.
That's why he became known as soft sword.
yeah.
He failed so miserably with huge armies, I might add. And then, of course, money was at the bottom of all of this.
You had to pay all their
And
people in the
you
army.
had to pay, and the problem was that he ran out of sources. In fact, he did some very dreadful things. There are infamous cases where he, in fact, imprisoned members of the family because the lord of the family wouldn't pay up, and some of those died in prison and indeed starved to death. That's the sort of person you're dealing with. With
Gross injustice.
John. Yeah, gross.
Now, David, one of those levies or taxes was called scutage.
That's right.
Tell us,
Scutage is what I
what's
was
that?
talking about, that he imposed, in fact, scutage, even in times of peace, repeatedly. And of course, like tax collectors all over, and we haven't lost the art of tax collecting, although in Australia some think so. The fact of the matter is that that's the sort of thing that he would come at.
Now, John actually levied this scutage 13 times in his reign,
That's right.
which was more than the 3 sovereigns before him.
Yes.
So what was scutage?
It was this special
War tax.
Oh,
Essentially,
war.
you know, in common parlance, that's exactly what
Now
it was.
let me give you another one. To pay for all his mercenaries and his soldiers, he would collect all this silver, melt it down, and there would be a shortage of the silver coins right through the realm. In fact, it even interrupted business because he was collecting this silver coin and making it ready to pay his mercenaries. So that was one aspect. The barons hated these taxes, and he just made them over and over and over again.
but he was also taxing the Jews in a special way, you were telling me.
Yes.
Well, that was a two-way process. They were providing the money, and then he was putting on a super tax. that's essentially. But it was particularly the City of London that was very, very upset, as Harold said before, on the issue of melting down the coin, or they would in fact get the coins and kind of slice them quietly away, so you had half the coin somewhere else. No, it was a real issue with the City of London.
But Rosemary, even beyond the wars and the taxes and the barons being unhappy, there was a trigger point that brought this Magna Carta to being. Let me just tell you a little bit about that. You know, in 1205, this is 10 years before Magna Carta, the Archbishop of Canterbury died. And the canons of the church said, we want to have this person as the new Archbishop. John thought, and he said, no, I want this person appointed, another one. And so both sent their representations across to Rome to talk with the Pope. And the Pope thought, and he says, no, I'm not having any of those. I'm going to appoint Stephen Langton. And Stephen Langton was not allowed because of that. John said, he's not coming to England.
And they wouldn't let him in.
And because of that, John not only didn't let him in for some time, a year or two, but he also took the income that Stephen would have received to himself because he needed the money. And by having this, the Pope finally says, all right, England is under interdict. Now, an interdict meant that there were no religious services. The crosses were taken down and put on the ground. If you wanted to be married, sorry. If you were buried, you're not buried in the consecrated ground of the cemetery, down in the ditches where you bury the body.
And there was no baptisms?
Baptisms?
Nothing at all. They cut out all the religious services essentially,
And in other
and
words,
left people in an age where religion played a very, very strong part. What happened, of course, was the interdict was like a death sentence.
yes, it was damnation.
It really had that effect.
And
John, he kept upping the ante, didn't he, Harold?
He did. He really felt, if the Pope will not take my representative as the Archbishop, he's likely to replace me. Now, so he said, that's why he said, not Stephen Langton. And this went on and on until 1213. And it's ironic. On the same day that Magna Carta was signed in 1215, in 1213, John's come to the end of the road, he says, no. And so he calls for the papal legate, who was Pandolf, and says here, I'm giving to you the crown of England and Ireland and these parts of France. They now belong to Innocent III and to St. Peter and St. Paul forever. And there'll be an annual tribute paid of 1,000 marks to the Pope. And he then said, I will be his vassal. And the barons said, we don't want to live under this foreign domination. Who is John to give away England.
That's right.
That was really the trigger point. So much so, even the King of France, who actually had tried and did try to get rid of John and also put in place his son, he in fact protested about the Pope's ruling on this. He said no one can give away their country the way John has.
Correct.
This was the trigger point.
Correct.
This was the real heart of the matter. And
Something
this
had
is
to be
what-
done.
Something had to be done and done quickly.
And so the barons got them all got together, and they make John come down to Runnymede in June, the 12th of June, and he signs this declaration that says you're not above the law. The law applies to
So who
everyone.
formulated the points?
Yes.
The barons, the 25 barons.
The barons with Stephen
Baron, but
Langton.
Stephen Langton is the real nub of what happened. Stephen Langton went back to the charters of
Henry the
Henry I in 1100, and we have a copy of that amongst those books, strange to say. And in fact, he really was the heart and soul of what was formulated, together with the barons, and of course, from hence. So in some ways, the earlier charters, right back to 800 AD and so on, all of those came into play, but it was Stephen Langton's.
Correct.
Well, that leaves me with a question. Barry, can you answer this? Stephen Langton, he was the Pope's
Archbishop
choice
of
for
Canterbury.
Archbishop of Canterbury, and yet he's helping these barons who are not happy that the king has given the land to the Pope.
It's a wonderful irony, isn't it?
Yeah, so what was happening there?
I'll let David answer this.
No, sorry. The interesting, Stephen Langton's the most interesting person. I believe under the Holy Spirit. He was the one who, in fact, we have in our Bibles, we have divisions into chapters and verses. Stephen Langton, we believe very strongly, was involved in that. He was a man who, in fact, was very pragmatic. And he was the one who went back and found a copy of Henry I's charter, a marvellous charter, great big thick one. And so you can assume that he summed up what the problems were. They were at a crisis point. They were at a trigger point, as Harold has called it. And so he played that vital role. And we may thank God for Stephen Langton's
So maybe he would have
entry.
been a good at his job as the in charge.
Oh,
of
yes.
the church.
Oh, yes.
But the irony
Always
was
the one.
that once the Magna Carta was signed, it was the Pope who then had to annul it with his bull. So the very person he had appointed had sort of almost gone over to the other side, as it were.
Yes.
That's right.
And created
That's
the
what it
problems.
seems like.
The other issue for John was that in 1214 he had another disastrous loss.
That's right.
And this was really building the pressure up. So the barons were not only unhappy about having their country given away, but they were unhappy because they also had to suffer more taxation, because when he lost the territories in France, he had to rely more on his own barons to raise the money. So things really just got to flashpoint.
Yeah, and particularly the City of London.
Yes.
That comes back and back into what happened here.
So we have these 25 barons in England who
That's right.
decide to write up this charter and force the king to sign it. Is that right? They
There were
forced
probably more than 25, but 25 were appointed as a sort of a nucleus
as
to work on it.
witnesses.
And unfortunately, my relatives were on the king's side of the king giving the properties over to, or the lands over to the Pope. And so they were on the wrong side in this issue.
Now-
I can give you some consolation on that. I believe that one of my relatives was on the Baron's side, but that's a strong family history would indicate that to be so, although I've never been able to entirely prove it. But the point of the matter was, the remarkable thing is, go to the actual first capital 1 of the Charter and read what it read in English. It wasn't in English then. First we've granted to God, and by this present Charter have confirmed for us and our heirs forever that the Church of England shall be free, shall have all our rights, liberties, and we have granted also and given to all the free men of our realm for us and our heirs forever these liberties underwritten to have and to hold. And the important thing about there's two things. One is the liberty of the Church is expressed again in 63 of the Charter, but in 1 here, here's Stephen Langton saying, we want freedom for the Church of England. It is unique. It's
Definitely.
unique.
And one of the things I discussed with Harold earlier was the fact that Henry VIII is known as the one who separated the Roman Church and the English Church.
Right.
And made a split down the middle because he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine.
Yes.
And the Pope wouldn't let him do so. So he made this split, but that was 319 years after Magna Carta was signed. And in the Magna Carta is this separation, basically, of the church that was in England from the church that was in Rome, and saying we want to be a separate church, we want religious liberty.
That's right.
And this man, Stephen Langton, who was the Pope's representative, is helping write
It's
this.
totally ironic, except I've come to the view, and the more I've read, I've come to the view that, in fact, here's a man under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he says, this is something I have to do. And he did it.
I can see an overriding action of God involved in that.
You can't just see the hand of God in history.
Yes.
That's the wonderful part about it.
Another ironic thing, Stephen Langton wasn't allowed to come to England for quite some time by John, but when he comes and John has given England to the Pope Innocent III, then he's using Stephen Langton to bolster his position and almost his supporter almost, because now John is saying, I will give my loyalty to the Pope. And so Stephen, in writing this, is acting for John at the same time. He was out of favour, but now he's in favour because John has turned around.
If you go into the British Library at Euston, it is, just down from the Euston station, you'll find up in the where the Brits keep their
Heritage?
All their treasures. You'll find there a copy of the Magna Carta which doesn't have a seal. In the middle of that, you'll find the Pope's Bull, which has a lovely big seal on it, right? And then thirdly, you'll find a Magna Carta copy which does have a seal on it, which is just somewhat later. It's really quite interesting to look at. You're not allowed to take photographs without...
The interesting thing is that the Magna Carta really wasn't implemented sort of in a really intense way at all, was it? Neither side really wanted to implement immediately, so they were dilatory about what they were doing. But eventually, the Magna Carta started to influence everyone's rights. So it escaped this notion of the higher classes in England, and then was later applied to everyone. But throughout the 13th century, after that signing, it went through a number of phases. So it was really pretty much in its final form.
It was re-signed so many times.
Yes. Even the following year, it was re-signed.
That's right.
Correct.
Yes, that was because of the crisis over the after John's death. And the King of France, Louis, wanted his son there, and in fact they sent out a fleet together with the son on it. And finally the Earl Marshal decided no. And he persuaded quite a number of the barons then to come over to the idea that 9-year-old Henry, I'm right, aren't I? 9-year-old Henry should be John's successor. Now, the interesting part is, though, the whole thing revolved on what happened in London, because the people in London had decided for Louis and his son, and but then when they were offered a re-signing of the Charter and the rights of London, which of course are part of the original Magna Carta, that's what happened in 1216, and that they then came over. The French fleet was defeated and went scurrying for home, and the end result was, as I say, the first thing that was done by this 9-year-old was to in fact re-sign.
I just want to go through, I've got a bit of a list here of some of the different clauses, because it just covered so many things. There's the freedom of the English Church, inheritance issues, seizure of land or rent in payment of debt, repayment of debt to Jews, levies, forced service, office offences, fines, justice, debts, removal of fish weirs, standard measures.
Yes.
God says, you shall have a standard measure, a just weight. You are not allowed to have something that is the wrong weight, and when you weigh it, the person gets less than what they are supposed to have. Self-incrimination.
Yes.
Freedom of movement of merchants, forests and offences, barons in control of abbeys, hostages, mercenaries, restoration of dispossessed lands, castles and liberties, women in the law, application of Welsh law and Welsh hostages, hostages of Scottish King Alexander. I mean, there's just so many different places or different things that they touched on in the Magna Carta to protect rights.
Many of these things were just local and soon came out of date. But there were 3 that really particularly lingered. One was around the English Church, the liberties of the English Church. The other one was around the freedom and liberties of London and all the other cities, boroughs, towns and ports in England. But the really big one for us was clauses 39 and 40 dealing with due process of the law. And David, you might like to make a comment about that.
We need to find out about that.
Look, what you've got to remember is this very quickly. What was the position before 1215 if you were found to be charged with an offence or something like that? You had three forms. You had the form of trial on oath, and you could bring along your witnesses and they'd all swear that your oath was so on and so forth. Then you had trial by ordeal, in which they ducked you in the ducking pond or something equivalent to that. I'm sounding humorous about it. It wasn't humorous. If you sunk, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. Not a terrible.
Wonderful. If you were innocent, you died.
That's right.
And if you were guilty, you were going to die anyway.
That's exactly right. The third thing was trial by battle. And those were the 3 forms that essentially were in place. And so the move to a trial where 39 and 40 has those specific witnesses. You couldn't be found guilty unless you had at least 2 witnesses, I think. I'm right.
Well, the Bible, God says,
the Bible teaches.
That's right.
2 or 3
and
witnesses.
you couldn't be convicted on your own statement alone. We seem to have forgotten about that today in so many quarters. Thirdly, of course, you had evidence, and then you had the trial by your own peers. It's marvellous,
And that
really.
came later, didn't it, David?
Yes. Some of these, what we must realise is that this whole business of trial by jury came almost on an evolutionary process, if I can describe it like that, because it gradually became the form of trial with what we understand today. And I think that's the part that's so... this charter included a whole lot of other things, including the Articles 20 on a free man shall not be immersed, which means sanctioned. Sanctions are in everybody's mind at the moment, particularly on a world scale. We can sanction all sorts of things.
Yes.
It's a way of forcing your own opinion, isn't it?
And it added for a trivial offence. And I won't go into that because I'd only get into an argument.
So the big issue was proportionality, wasn't it?
Yes, it's
making sure that the sanction
right.
fitted the situation rather than being disproportionate.
Mm.
And another one, justice delayed is justice denied.
That's right.
You just can't put someone in prison and leave them there.
And forget about them, throw away the key.
Correct.
Without
That's
having
right.
a reason
And
for
that
them
was
to be
done.
there.
Yes, that's
And
right.
that led to the Habeas Corpus Act of
Correct.
1640.
That's right.
And maybe, David, another comment from you on that would be...
Yes,
Explain
well,
habeas corpus.
Habeas corpus is wonderful in the sense that it comes directly down from Magna Carta, although there'll be some people who deny that. But nevertheless, if you go to the statement that was made, the preface to the 1640 Act in Parliament, you'll find there they say this is coming back from Magna Carta. This whole thing flows, and it of course has become a key element, very much a key element in modern jurisprudence even.
So habeas corpus, obviously a Latin term, means what?
Means you
Deliver the body.
Deliver the body.
I'm sorry, that really is stated a little crudely. What it means is bring the body before the court and will determine whether you have a right to hold this man. In one of those volumes that are shown in the inset there, there's an example there that's printed 1732, an example of a man who was seized in England, taken in fact to Ireland, and there they tried to try him, and a writ of habeas corpus was issued, and they said, sorry, this man is not here by due process, you can't try him. And that's, as I say, that's dated about the early 1700s. That shows how
Now this is a remarkable development, because through much of history people could be just arrested, thrown into prison, denied food, and just die in prison. Whereas this meant that if you arrested someone, within a reasonable time you had to bring them before the court and justify that person's imprisonment and charge them. And so this meant that due process, justice, was being implemented in a systematic way in a society which was independent of anyone else's opinion. The process was king, and this is really important. Really important. If we lose that principle, imagine what your life would be like if you can be just incarcerated without charge for a lengthy period of time. It would change the entire nature of our society.
Now, the other important one, for the king, no one is above the law. If you come from a position of privilege, if you're a baron or the king, the law is the governing factor, and Parliament became established as the place of the voice of the people. The king who could do what he wanted, and we have down through the Stuart kings, James and Charles, first and second and so on, they claimed divine right. God has made me king, I can do what I want. This starts to say, no, you can't. No one is above the law. The law supersedes everybody.
Well, Henry VIII tried to be the super king above the law.
They've all tried it.
Everything he wanted, he got.
That's right.
And so that began to be eroded through the Magna Carta, saying that even royalty could be brought before the law.
There's a classic modern example. When President Clinton was in fact involved in a case in the United States, and he was still president, and he said, look, I want this delayed until after my presidency ceases. a judge of the federal court decided, no, that is not so. No one is above the law.
Correct.
And ordered that the case go on. It's most interesting.
So Magna Carta is really telling us that it was the foundation of our rule of law, the whole concept of the rule of law.
And Parliament.
And Parliament.
That's
yes.
right. It is.
Yeah.
It's absolutely critical.
So there must have been a change, Harold, in terms of the way the common man now would be looked upon. And he had rights now, is that right?
The common man got his rights a little later.
Yes.
It wasn't 1215, but this becomes the type for other rights. The Bill of Rights, for instance, is another one that came through. And when James II fled England and they invited William of Orange to come over, the first thing the Bill of Rights is put before him based on Magna Carta and habeas corpus and all of these. Here it is. If you're going to be our king, you agree to this. And so by that time, the common person had more rights then.
Well, David, I have a question about something significant happened in the 13th century, should I say, that resulted in the trial by jury in the 14th century. Is it just the situation of the Magna Carta being signed that brought about having a trial by jury?
No,
because you mentioned trial by jury before.
Yes.
How did that come in?
No, it came up through the various charters granted over the years by Edward the First or Edward the Second, Edward the Third, and then through to the charter and the super charter that.
Because there were many different charters.
There were many charters, but this was a process that gradually extended, and indeed, just moving back just for a moment, you talked about how the original charter really didn't cover everyone, but in fact, in Mr. Justice Stevens, who later on wrote our criminal code for Queensland, and I believe possibly Western Australia, was copied on that. In talking about that, he wrote in 1838, he talks here of the Great Charter, that the same services which were remitted in favour of the barons shouldn't be in like manner remitted in favour of their vassals. It establishes an equality of rates and measures, we've talked about that, exempted the merchants from arbitrary imposts, gave them liberty to enter and depart the kingdom, and this is the part that's interesting, it even extended to the lowest bondsman.
Correct.
Should not be subject to the forfeiture of the implements of his tillage. Lastly, by the 39th article of the same charter was enacted that no subject should be exiled or in any shape whatsoever molested, either as person or effects, other by judgment, otherwise by the judgment of his peers and according to the law of the land. So what happened was it gradually gained favour through those various charters, and we really don't have enough time to go into them.
Yeah.
And the whole concept of trial by jury was just orders of magnitude better than what had preceded.
Oh yes. So gradually the old forms fell out, although it's really rather funny. If trial by battle existed until about 1820 something, when someone challenged in the court, they said, they're not accepting my word, I'll have a challenge of trial by battle, and they found it was still on the statute books. So very quickly got rid of it. Very quickly got rid of it.
If you went into battle and you survived, then you were not guilty.
Oh yes,
Correct.
if you survived, you were innocent, but the other fellow was obviously guilty. Right.
What were some of the, we touched earlier, I think Barry touched on, and Harold also, some of the other countries who who had
Affected
their
by it.
laws and their statutes, their religious freedom, their religious freedom and their civil freedoms based on the Magna Carta. Can you just take us through some of those, Dave?
Yes, I can really. The best I can think of, and I'm sorry that I'm reading these things, but I want to be totally accurate about it. One of the most famous statements on it was made by Lord Denning, 1964 in the Royal Courts of Justice. He was Master, of course, of the Rolls, and he was talking here. He was congratulating the University of Virginia on commemorating the it would have been the 750th anniversary of Magna Carta. And he had this to say, and it's really right on point. What was instituted by the no, I'm sorry, forgive me, I've picked up the wrong
While David's
one.
trying to find that, I might just mention that there were two streams. There was the English stream of jurisprudence and the continental one.
That's right.
And on the continent, it tended to be inquisitional in the sense that you were guilty and then you had to prove your innocence.
Correct.
That's right.
Whereas the English system was you were innocent until you were proved guilty. There's quite a difference between those two systems.
Which is biblical. Because
Yes.
God said that someone could not be held guilty except by the witness of two or three other people
Well, remember
who
that
could prove their guilt.
the Inquisition was established in 1225, so this is just 10 years after Magna Carta, but it's on the continent. So I believe that influenced the continental systems of jurisprudence.
Yes, it did.
And so we have these two streams coming down to us through the West. One where you're innocent until you're proved guilty, and the other one's no, you're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. Now, I know which one I'd rather have.
Yes.
Yes,
definitely.
absolutely. Going back to that point before that you asked, Lord Denning said this: when the colonists crossed the sea from England and settled in Virginia, they took with them the principles set down in the Great Charter. They planted in this colony the roots of freedom under law. The colony flourished, and we can see what it developed from it. Look at the Constitution of the United States. Look at the Bill of Rights. They're direct descendants of the Great Charter. It's fitting that Virginia should honour the 750th anniversary of its signing. The series of essays, which begins with the publication as the first fruit of Virginia's commemoration. That was November 1964, and
So
it states it, and that's very much so. The colonists took with them the very freedom under law that we're talking about.
The
fact,
religious freedom and the civil freedom.
That's right.
Both of them
They're,
together, not one or the other.
Rosemary.
Kingdom without a pope and without a king.
Without a pope. Church without a pope.
Church without a pope.
That's right.
Rosemary,
Church.
this Magna Carta and its freedoms come down to us even in what we call the modern age, 1948. You have the United Nations
that's very true.
and the International Declaration there of Human Rights. And there you have the freedom to worship, you have the freedom to live by law and trial, approximate, and so this basis from 800 years is still with us today in a greater form. And this has become worldwide with the Declaration of Human Rights that most countries will agree to.
Yes.
And our own religious liberty statute here in Australia came to us from America, which came
From Magna Carta.
from Magna Carta.
That's right.
That's right.
And then I would presume that because Magna Carta was a British charter and it had such an impact on law and order, freedom of religion, freedom of civil liberties, in throughout Britain, it would have then flowed on to the colonies, all of
Yes.
the colonies
Oh,
around
yes.
the world of the British Commonwealth, because the Britain had rule of countries everywhere. And so I presume it's there too.
It even went a little bit into France with the Declaration of the Rights of Man after the French Revolution.
That's right.
They looked at what Britain was doing and said, hey, we can copy some of those into our Declaration of Rights. And so it's a worldwide effect that's come down to us today.
It took a little while for it to escape its English foundations, but when it did have an influence, a disproportionate influence across the world, I
Correct.
believe.
Because if the French Revolution, the time of the French Revolution, that they started instituting some of the things from Magna Carta, then once again, that would have spilled into the colonies of the
Yes.
French, I would presume.
Yes.
Now, the digital age has actually created some real challenges to Magna Carta.
Oh, yes.
The whole issue that we have in the world today with terrorism and surveillance
And privacy.
and privacy and rights and due process is all being challenged. And so really, on the 800th anniversary, we have some really significant issues emerging around the heritage of Magna Carta and what it means to live in our own society.
Actually, I'd like to have a bit more of a discussion on those particular issues. First, before we do that, we want to take you to the 3ABN Australia address roll. With radio, Barry has actually done a much deeper interview with David and Pastor Harker, as well as with John Hammond, who gave some historical stories. And if you want to get hold of that to find out more about Magna Carta, you can contact us here at 3ABN Australia. If you want to contact us about anything else or make donations or anything like that, contact us on these details.
If you would like to contact 3ABN Australia, you may do so in the following ways. You may write to 3ABN Australia, PO Box 752, Morisset, New South Wales 2264, Australia. That's Post Office Box 752, Morisset, New South Wales 2264, Australia. Or you may call 02 4973 3456. That's 02 4973 3456 from 8:30am to 5pm Monday to Thursday, or 8:30am to 12pm Fridays, New South Wales time. You may also email us at mail@3abnaustralia.org.au. That's mail@3abnaustralia, all one word, .org.au. Thank you for all you do to help us light the world with the glory of God's truth.
We're talking with Barry Harker, David Fitzgibbon, and Harold Harker. These men have an interest in Magna Carta, but we're going to just take a brief moment to look at, here we are 800 years on, and what is the significance of us for today, the Magna Carta? What's happening to the principles that governance has been established on? What's happening now, Harold, in the world today?
Well, you have extremes of every civilization. Whether you whatever religion it is, there are extremes, and Magna Carta says, hey, there are basic freedoms, and some people are saying, oh no, we don't want those freedoms, we're going to override them. And so you have civil and religious freedom under attack right around the world today.
Including in the United States.
Yes.
There's a survey done recently which indicated that more than half of the Republican voters who were surveyed wanted Christianity as their state religion. That would require them to overturn their constitution and rewrite at least the First Amendment of it. And so that, when you look at history, you realise that the freedoms that we've enjoyed in the West haven't always been around. I mean, religious freedom is really only a couple of hundred years old, as opposed to toleration. So, are we willing to overturn these aspects of the American Constitution? What is going to be what's going to be the outcome of that?
And the flow-on.
And the flow-on
to
effects
places like Australia and other countries.
could be massive, absolutely massive.
See, look, let's be really quite bold here. Let's look at the Patriot Act in the United States. Let's look at the Anti-Terrorism Acts, which Professor George Williams of Sydney University describes as the strongest in the world. And he's not on his own. There are various other commentators, including Brett Walker, SC, who was formerly the Independent National Security Monitor for Australia. These laws, well, if we take America first, and we look we compare the Patriot Act to the 13 exceptions under their constitution, including the first and the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, they cut across their very constitutional base. And I'm not the only one who thinks that.
So there's an erosion taking place.
It's a terribly strong attack.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't call it an erosion because erosion can be slow.
You've got to. I think you've got to stand up, and George Williams, and I'm quoting here from August 11, 2014, the Sydney Morning Herald. He says, "Anti-terrorism reforms put democracy at risk," and it's very true. And of course, instead of getting better, since then, we've included further laws, all of which cut across the basic freedom. And in the United States, I know a little bit about that, but the Patriot Act and why the Founding Fathers, after they put in place the Constitution, then moved to put a series of exceptions in those, and included, of course, were the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting freedom of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech of the press. Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their houses, papers, effects, unreasonable searches.
So what you're saying, David, is that this is really bringing our society to a point where we have to decide what sort of society we want to have.
Well,
Absolutely.
It's taking away, you have minority groups who are taking charge and pushing their agendas, and when they get what they want, it actually takes away the freedoms of everybody else. And you look at the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech is being eroded away. You can't say what you think or what you believe based on your religion, because some other group will say, "I'm sorry, that's against us, you're in trouble."
The digital age.
And think of this. Why did the Founding Fathers in America put in place those amendments? They put them in place quite simply because they had within living memory known oppression.
True.
And that's why they put them in place.
Yeah.
We're living in a changing world. It's changing very quickly.
The digital age is really just eroding our privacy, so it's a serious time for us and a serious time for our society.
I hope that our viewers have enjoyed our discussion today. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this is a fascinating subject. Get the radio interview. God bless you. We'll see you next time.